At my wedding, my mother-in-law humiliated my father in front of everyone. She thought he was a nobody. She was wrong. The strongest memory I have from my wedding day wasn't the music, it wasn't the ceremony. It was my father's expression. A look of quiet sadness at the exact moment my mother-in-law introduced him to her friends as the cleaning guy. All of it disguised as a joke, the kind only the person telling it and the people laughing seemed to understand. But that wasn't the only face burned into my memory that night. Minutes later, when I picked up the microphone in the middle of the reception, it was my mother-in-law's look of horror that no one could ignore. Before I continue my story, tell me where in the world you're listening from, and follow the channel to hear more stories like mine. At the beginning of the day, everything felt like a dream. The ceremony was beautiful. My mother-in-law had paid for all the wedding arrangements, and to avoid being rude, we let her invite her Pilates group, the same women she had been meeting with religiously every Tuesday and Thursday for years. And of course, part of the menu had to be gluten-free and free of refined sugar. My husband refers to that group as bitter women who think they're sweet. For a long time, I wondered whether he noticed how much his own mother resembled them. On the night of my wedding, I had no doubts. The problem started during dinner, after the ceremony. My mother-in-law went from her first glass of champagne to the second, then the third. The laughter grew louder, looser, more confident. At first, I'll admit I was happy. I thought the wedding was fun for the guests, especially for my husband's mother. Until I saw her walk over to my father. He didn't need to say a word. The moment she reached him, his face changed. It was an expression I knew far too well, a mix of sadness and shame, a look that appeared whenever the world made him feel small, even though to me he has always been the greatest man I've ever known. Seeing that look sent a chill through my entire body. My feet started moving towards them immediately. I felt the blood rush to my face, my cheeks burning, as if my body had reacted before my mind could catch up. I was only a few steps away when the photographer suddenly stepped in front of me, smiling, far too enthusiastic for the moment. "Love, we need a few more photos," he said, gently grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the other side of the room. I tried to resist for a second, but he was already talking about lighting, angles, and making the most of the moment. I let myself be guided away, even though I wasn't really there anymore. As I posed, I kept my eyes fixed on that circle of women, glasses raised. My father stood at the center, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze lowered as if trying to take up less space than he actually deserved. It was eating me alive. When I was finally released from the photos, I walked straight to my family's table. I spoke to my sister the moment I saw her. "Where's Dad?" She glanced around before answering. "He went to the bathroom." She paused briefly, then added, almost without thinking, "By the way, your mother-in-law is a snake." My stomach tightened. "Why?" I asked. "What happened? I saw her talking to Dad. He didn't look okay." My sister took a deep breath, like she was still trying to process it herself. "She started making those harmless little jokes," she said he was only invited because his cleaning services were excellent. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. "What did you just say?" "She said that after the party, he'd make the place shine." She said it laughing, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Something sank deep inside me. Thoughts crashed through my head faster than I could organize them. Did I marry the wrong person? Is it even possible to undo this? How did I let this happen? I looked at my sister, still trying to understand. Dad didn't say anything to her? Didn't shut her down? He's literally the wealthiest person in that room. Maybe if he spoke her language. My sister shrugged, a tiredness in her expression that had been there for a long time. "Since Mom died, he's been more restrained," she said. "He avoids confrontation. He says arguing doesn't change who people are, it only reveals them." Her words landed heavily. That's when I understood that my father wasn't silent because he didn't feel pain. He was silent because he had always been the one expected to be strong. And something inside me refused to accept that. Not again. My dad, Michael Davis, has never been the kind of man that fills a room. He doesn't walk in loud. He doesn't shake hands like he's collecting favors. He doesn't talk about what he owns, where he's been, who he knows. If you met him at a grocery store, you'd probably assume he was just another older man picking out apples too carefully, reading the labels like the words mattered. He has that calm, almost gentle way of moving through the world, like he's learned that attention is expensive, and most people spend it on the wrong things. But I've watched my father do things that would make the loudest person in any room go quiet. Not because he wanted to impress anyone, because he genuinely didn't think it was a big deal. When I was little, I used to get frustrated with him, not because he was ever unkind. He was the opposite, patient to a fault, the kind of dad who'd kneel down and tie your shoe again, even if you just kicked it loose out of stubbornness. I got frustrated because I couldn't understand why he let people misread him. There was this one moment that lives in my mind like a scene from a movie, except it didn't feel like a movie at the time. It felt like embarrassment. I was maybe 8 or 9. We were at my school's career day, and parents were invited to come talk about what they did. Most kids' parents showed up in uniforms or suits. A police officer, a nurse, a man with a fancy briefcase who told everyone he worked in finance and made it sound like magic. My father arrived in his usual clothes, plain button-down shirt, simple watch, shoes that looked worn in, not worn out. He sat in the back with his hands folded and listened, smiling politely at the other parents like he was the one honored to be in their presence. Then my teacher, Mrs. Rollins, asked him what he did, and I remember the way she said it, not cruel, just dismissive, like she'd already decided. "So, Michael," she said with a bright voice, "what line of work are you in?" He paused, like he always did, as if he wanted to choose a truthful answer that wouldn't create a mess. He said, "I manage a few things." Mrs. Rollins laughed lightly. "A few things? Like what?" He smiled. "Property, investments, some community projects." And that should have been enough, but it wasn't enough for her. "Oh," she said, eyes flicking to his shoes, "so you're like a landlord." The way she said landlord sounded like dirty work. I waited for my father to correct her, to say something that made her eyebrows jump, to explain that he wasn't just a landlord and that her assumption was small. But he didn't. He just nodded once, calmly, and said, "Something like that." Afterwards, I pulled on his sleeve in the parking lot, furious in the way only a child can be. "Why didn't you tell her?" I demanded. "She thinks you're, you know." He looked at me, puzzled. "Thinks I'm what?" "Like you're nobody," I said, and my voice cracked because even then it felt wrong coming out of my mouth. He stopped walking. The afternoon sun caught the side of his face, and I remember seeing the faint lines near his eyes, the kind you only notice when someone smiles a lot. "Sharon," he said gently, "people think what they need to think. If I spend my life correcting them, what kind of life is that?" "But it's not fair," I insisted. He crouched down so we were eye level, right there between rows of minivans. "Fair isn't something you chase by probing yourself," he said. "Fair is something you practice by being who you are." That was my father. That was always my father. Even before Mom died, he was quiet about money. But after she died, it became something else. It became sacred. My mother, Ann Davis, was the bright part of our family. She had this laugh that filled the kitchen and spilled into every room like warmth. When she got sick, it felt impossible. When she died, it felt wrong, like someone had taken the center of the world and left the rest of us spinning around in empty space. My dad didn't fall apart the way movies show men falling apart. He didn't punch walls or scream into the night. He got quieter. He did what he always did. He handled things. He made sure Claire and I ate, even when food tasted like paper. He packed our lunches, he drove us to school, he showed up, but something in him shifted permanently. Like grief didn't make him weaker, it just made him thinner, more careful with his words, more careful with his energy, more careful with conflict, like conflict was a luxury he no longer had. And the strangest part was this. After Mom died, the moments when people underestimated him seemed to bother him less. It wasn't that he didn't feel it, I could tell he did. It was that he refused to give it power. There were times I saw it happen in front of me, a waiter speaking only to the men in suits and treating my dad like he was just with them, a neighbor talking down to him about how hard it must be to keep up with property taxes, like my father was always one emergency away from drowning. Every time, my dad would smile politely, say thank you, and move on, and I'd be the one clenching my jaw, burning with anger on his behalf. Claire used to say I inherited Mom's fire. She was right. My dad used to tell me, your mother was brave in the way she loved. Don't lose that. But loving like that meant I noticed everything, every slight, every laugh that didn't include him, every sideways glance, every moment someone decided he was small. That's why, at my wedding, his expression hit me like a slap, because I'd seen that look before. Not often, not lately, but enough times to recognize it instantly. It wasn't the look of a man who needed money. It wasn't even a look of a man who was embarrassed about a job. It was the look of a man who had spent his whole life choosing dignity and still getting punished for it. The look of someone who didn't want to make a scene because making a scene would mean admitting the scene mattered. And that night, with champagne glasses clinking and laughter bouncing off the walls, I realized something that made my throat tighten. This wasn't just a bad joke, it was an old wound, one I thought we'd outgrown, one I thought the world had stopped testing. But the world hadn't stopped. It had just waited for a moment big enough, public enough, cruel enough to reopen it. Before I married Daniel, I thought I understood his mother. Mary Ann Collins was the kind of woman who could make you feel welcome and judged in the same breath. She hugged tightly, smiled often, and asked questions that sounded thoughtful until you replayed them later and realized they'd been measurements. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. When Daniel introduced me to her, she held my hands a little too long and said, "You're very natural." The pause sat between us like something unfinished. "Thank you," I said, unsure what else to do. She tilted her head, steadying me. "And what do your parents do?" Not, "How are they?" Not, "Where are they from?" "What do they do?" I answered honestly. I always did back then. "My dad manages properties," I said. "My mom passed away a few years ago." Her smile softened, but her eyes sharpened. "Oh, that must have been very difficult. For your father, too, I imagine. Managing things alone." The word alone landed heavier than it should have. Daniel caught my eye from across the room and gave me a look I didn't understand yet. It wasn't warning, it wasn't apology, it was familiarity. As I got to know Mary Ann better, patterns emerged. She never asked people where they grew up, only where they live now. She commented on clothing, but always framed it as admiration. "That jacket looks expensive," she'd say lightly, or, "I love that brand, it's such an investment." She talked about money the way some people talk about weather. Constantly, casually, like it was neutral, like it didn't shape her opinions. But it did. She remembered what people drove. She remembered job titles. She remembered which guests brought nice wine and which brought something she later referred to as sweet. And she always laughed after saying things that didn't quite feel like jokes. The first time I noticed Daniel reacting to it was at a dinner party early in our relationship. One of his cousins brought a new boyfriend, a quiet guy who worked as a mechanic. He answered questions politely, clearly a little uncomfortable. Mary Ann leaned over to me, her voice low, conspiratorial. "She's very handy," she said, smiling. That must be useful. I waited for Daniel to say something. He didn't. Later that night in the car, I finally asked him, "Does your mom realize how that sounds?" He exhaled slowly, like someone releasing air they'd been holding for years. She realizes, she just doesn't think it matters. I asked him why he never called her out. He shrugged. She doesn't hear criticism, she hears disrespect, and then she doubles down. There was no bitterness in his voice, just resignation. Over time, I learned how Daniel had adapted. He redirected conversations, he changed subjects, he gave non-answers to her questions, he smoothed over moments before they could sharpen. It wasn't that he agreed with her, it was that he'd learned fighting her was like trying to correct someone who thought they were already right. The truth was, Marianne believed she was kind. She volunteered, she donated, she hosted fundraisers and charity brunches. She knew how to say all the right things in public. She was generous in ways that were visible, but kindness to her came with conditions. It was extended more easily to people who looked the part, who spoke the language, who belonged. When we got engaged, she took control of the wedding planning immediately. "I just want everything to be beautiful," she said, pressing her hand to her chest. "This is such a reflection of the family." Her family, I noticed, not ours. She insisted on certain venues because of the guest list they attracted, certain menus because of what they signaled. She invited her Pilates group without asking, calling them the girls, like they were part of the package. "These women are like sisters to me, and they're very particular." I smiled and nodded, trying not to feel like I was being fitted into someone else's vision. Throughout the planning, she asked about my father only in passing. "Will your dad be okay with all the walking? Does your father prefer simple things? Your dad won't mind sitting wherever, right?" Each question sounded considerate. Each one quietly placed him somewhere lower. I told myself she didn't know him, that she was just this way. But the night of the wedding forced me to stop lying to myself. When I watched her laugh with her friends, champagne in hand, her confidence growing with each glass, I saw something familiar. Not cruelty, certainty. The certainty of someone who believed they could label people without consequence. When my sister told me exactly what Marianne had said to my father, something inside me clicked into place with a dull, heavy sound. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't alcohol talking. This wasn't a joke gone wrong. This was what happened when a woman who measured worth by appearances met a man who refused to advertise his. And in that moment, standing in my wedding dress, surrounded by people celebrating love and family, I understood something that made my chest ache. What happened to my father wasn't accidental. It was inevitable. After Claire told me exactly what Marianne had said, the noise of the reception faded into something distant and unreal. Laughter still rose and fell around me, glasses still clinked, music still played, but it all felt like it was happening behind a wall of glass, like I was watching my own wedding from the outside. I kept replaying the words in my head. Only invited because his cleaning services were excellent. The casual cruelty of it made my stomach turn, not because it was clever, not because it was shocking, because it was so easy for her to say. I excused myself from the table before I did something impulsive. I needed to find my father, not to confront him, not yet, just to see him. I found him outside the reception hall, standing near the edge of the patio where the lights softened and the noise thinned. He had his jacket draped over his arm, like he was debating whether to leave early or just needed a moment of air. When he saw me, his face brightened instinctively. "There you are," he said. "I was starting to think you forgot about me." He smiled when he said it, but I saw the effort behind it. I stepped closer, suddenly unsure of what to say. Up close, I noticed how still he was, how composed, how carefully he was holding himself together. "Dad," I said quietly. "Are you okay?" He waved a hand lightly, dismissive. "Of course, it's your wedding. I didn't want to interrupt." Interrupt. The word stung. I heard what Marianne said. I watched his eyes carefully, waiting for a reaction. There was one, just not the one I expected. His shoulders tightened, almost imperceptibly. Then he exhaled and looked away, out toward the dark lawn. "She didn't mean anything by it," he said calmly. "People joke differently." I felt heat rush to my face. "She called you a cleaning guy." He gave a small shrug. "I've been called worse." "That doesn't make it okay." He turned back to me then, his expression gentle but firm, the way it used to be when I was a teenager and thought I knew better than him. "Sharon," he said, "this isn't the moment. Today is about you and Daniel, not me." There it was, the same instinct I'd seen my whole life. Protect the peace, absorb the discomfort, make himself smaller so others could stay comfortable. "I don't want you to think I'm embarrassed of you," I said tightly. He frowned, surprised. "Embarrassed? Why would you think that?" "Because you didn't say anything," I whispered. "Because you just stood there and let her—" He interrupted me gently. "I didn't let her do anything. I chose not to engage." The distinction mattered to him. I knew that. But standing there, watching him carry something that shouldn't have been his to carry, I felt something twist painfully inside me. "What if I say something?" I asked. "What if I talk to her?" He shook his head immediately. "Please don't." "Why not?" "Because it will become bigger than it needs to be," he said. "Because it will follow you into your marriage, and because I don't need defending." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't about defending him. It was about refusing to accept disrespect dressed up as humor. But I also saw the fear behind his words. Not fear of Marianne. Fear of being the reason my wedding became uncomfortable. Fear of being a burden. "I've handled things like this my whole life," he said quietly. "They pass." I nodded, even though I didn't agree. We stood there for a moment in silence. The music drifted out from the open doors, distorted and distant. Somewhere inside, people were dancing. This was the moment, I realized, when I was supposed to let it go. Smile, return to the party, pretend this was a misunderstanding, tell myself it wasn't worth it. And part of me wanted to do exactly that. I thought about Daniel, about his family, about how new marriages are fragile things, easily strained by conflict. I thought about the looks I'd get, the whispers, the tension. I thought about regret. And then I looked at my father again, at the way he stood slightly apart, like he didn't want to take up too much space at my own wedding. And something inside me settled. If I stayed silent, I wouldn't be keeping the peace. I would be choosing it. And I would be choosing it over him. As I walked back toward the reception, my heart pounding, one thought repeated itself with unsettling clarity. Silence wouldn't make me neutral. It would make me complicit. By the time I walked back into the reception, the night had shifted. It wasn't obvious at first. Nothing dramatic had happened. The lights were still warm, the music still upbeat, the tables still crowded with half-empty glasses and folded napkins. But the energy had changed, in a way you only notice when you stop being part of it. The room was looser now, louder, the kind of loose that comes after enough champagne to make people forget who's watching. Marianne was in her element. She stood near the center of the room, glass in hand, her laughter cutting cleanly through the music. People gravitated toward her without quite realizing they were doing it. She had that kind of presence, not warmth exactly, but authority disguised as charm. Every time she spoke, someone leaned in. I watched as she touched arms lightly when she laughed, as if marking territory, as she nodded approvingly at stories that fit her worldview and redirected ones that didn't.
as she corrected details casually, effortlessly, always smiling. She looked comfortable, victorious even. Her Pilates group clustered around her like satellites, each one eager to contribute something amusing, something impressive. They laughed a little too loudly at her comments. They watched her for cues on when to smile, when to shake their heads sympathetically. I wondered how many of them laughed earlier when Marianne made that joke about my father. The thought made my chest tighten. I found Daniel near the bar talking to one of his old college friends. When he saw me, he smiled immediately, but the smile faltered when he took in my face. "You okay?" he asked quietly, stepping closer. "I'm fine," I said automatically. He didn't believe me. He never did when I used that tone. He followed my gaze without asking. His eyes landed on his mother, then shifted subtly across the room, landing on my father.
Michael sat at our family's table, his back straight but his shoulders slightly drawn in, like he was trying not to intrude on the space around him. He held his glass with both hands, listening more than speaking, nodding politely when someone addressed him. He looked smaller than he should have. Daniel noticed it too. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She's had a lot to drink," he said carefully, as if naming it might soften it. I nodded. "I know." He hesitated. "Did something happen earlier?" I considered telling him, right there in the middle of the reception, but the words felt heavy, dangerous, like once spoken they couldn't be taken back. "Later," I said. "Not right now." He searched my face, then nodded. "Okay." But he didn't move far from me after that. As the evening wore on, Marianne grew bolder. She clinked her glass to get attention once, laughing when a few people shushed her playfully. She waved it off, saying she was just teasing, but I saw the way her eyes flicked toward the microphone stand near the DJ booth. It hadn't been used yet. I caught snippets of conversation as I moved through the room, thanking guests, accepting congratulations, smiling until my cheeks hurt. She should say a few words. She paid for most of this, after all. Marianne would be great. She's so articulate. Each comment landed like a small warning bell. At one point, someone actually nudged the microphone stand closer to the edge of the dance floor, laughing about how it was just in case. Just in case. My heart started to beat faster, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Not yet. I watched my father again. He hadn't noticed any of this, or maybe he had and he was choosing not to. That was the thing about him. You could never quite tell where his attention was resting. He observed without inserting himself, accepted without absorbing. But now, knowing what I knew, every small detail felt amplified. The way he smiled when spoken to, the way he declined a second drink, the way he kept glancing toward the exit, like he was calculating the appropriate time to leave without being rude. I felt a sharp pang of guilt. This was supposed to be a night where he felt proud, where he felt celebrated. Instead, he looked like a guest who was grateful just to be included. I turned away before the thought could settle too deeply. Daniel leaned closer to me again, his voice low. "You're shaking." I hadn't noticed. "I just need a minute," I said. He squeezed my hand gently. "Whatever you need." I stepped away under the pretense of checking on something with the planner, but really I just needed space to think. My mind felt crowded, loud, thoughts overlapping and colliding. If Marianne spoke publicly, what would she say? Would she embarrass herself? Would she embarrass my father again? I pictured him sitting there, forced to smile through another joke, another comment wrapped in laughter.
Something inside me tightened, like a knot being pulled too far. I realized then that I was already planning something. Not consciously, not clearly, but I was watching the room differently now, tracking movement, noting who was nearby.
Noticing where the microphone was, who had access to it, how quickly someone could reach it. I wasn't thinking in words, I was thinking in instincts. Daniel caught my eye from across the room, concern written plainly on his face. I gave him a small smile, hoping it looked reassuring, hoping he wouldn't ask me anything else yet. Marianne laughed again, louder this time, and someone handed her another glass. She raised it in mock protest, then accepted it anyway. "Someone should let her make a toast," one of her friends said loudly, not even trying to be discreet. Marianne glanced toward the DJ booth. Then, with an easy confidence that made my stomach drop, she started moving in that direction. The room's attention shifted subtly, like a tide turning. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. Anticipation rippled outward. I felt my pulse in my ears. The DJ reached for the microphone. And just before it changed hands, I took a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The microphone never quite made it to Marianne's hand. I don't think anyone noticed at first. The shift was subtle, the way moments usually are before they change everything. 1 second, the DJ was smiling politely, holding the mic halfway out. The next, he hesitated, glancing past her shoulder toward someone approaching from the side, toward me. I hadn't planned it the way people imagine plans. There was no speech rehearsed in my head, no dramatic line waiting to be delivered. I just knew that if Marianne spoke next, something would be taken from my father that I wouldn't be able to give back. So I stepped forward. "I'm sorry," I said softly, placing my hand on the microphone. My voice carried more than I expected it to. "If it's okay, I'd like to say something first." The room stilled in that polite, uncertain way crowds do when they don't know what kind of moment they're being invited into. Marianne turned to look at me, surprise flickering across her face before she recovered with a bright smile. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, already stepping back. "I was just about to—" "I know," I said gently. I took the microphone from the DJ before he could second-guess himself. My hands were steady, which surprised me. My heart was not. Daniel had moved closer without me noticing. He stood just behind me, close enough that I could feel his presence, his quiet support. He didn't ask me what I was doing. He didn't stop me. He trusted me. I looked out at the room, at the people smiling expectantly, at Marianne's friends, curious now, at my sister, whose eyes widened slightly as she realized this wasn't part of the plan. And then I looked at my father. Michael sat exactly where I'd left him. He hadn't moved toward the center of the room. He hadn't leaned forward. He didn't look confused or alarmed. He looked resigned, like he assumed this wasn't about him. My throat tightened. I wasn't planning to speak, but tonight has been full of moments that reminded me why family matters so much. A few people nodded. This sounded like a normal wedding sentiment. Safe. I've been thinking a lot about the people who raised me, about the kind of love that doesn't announce itself, the kind that shows up quietly every single day. I saw my father look up then, just slightly. "My mom isn't here tonight," I said, my voice softening. "But if she were, she'd be standing in the back telling me not to make a fuss. She believed that the strongest things didn't need an audience." There was a pause. Not awkward. Attentive. "And she loved a man who lived that way," I said. "My dad." A few heads turned toward Michael. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the attention, but he didn't look away. "I grew up watching him choose restraint when it would have been easier to choose pride," I went on. "Watching him listen when he could have spoken. Watching him give without asking for recognition." Someone near the front frowned slightly, as if trying to understand where this was going. "He taught me that you don't measure people by what they show. You measure them by what they protect." I took a breath. The room was quiet now. fully quiet. "For as long as I can remember, my father has managed things," I said, echoing his old words without meaning to. "Homes, buildings, investments, projects that don't make headlines, projects that don't come with titles you brag about at dinner parties." There it was. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. I saw someone glance at someone else. A couple of Marianne's friends leaned in closer, their smiles faltering. "He started small. He worked patiently. He believed in steady growth, not flash. He believed in building things that lasted longer than first impressions." I wasn't looking at Marianne anymore. I was looking at my father. "And somewhere along the way," I said, my voice quieter now, "my father built a life that allowed us to never worry, not because he chased wealth, but because he respected it enough not to worship it." A man near the back let out a soft, involuntary sound, like he'd just realized something and wasn't sure he was allowed to react yet. I don't think most people here know this, because my dad never felt the need to correct assumptions. There was a murmur now, low, uncertain. "My father funds scholarships anonymously," I said. "He invests in housing projects most people overlook. He sits on boards he never mentions and supports causes that don't put his name on plaques." The murmurs grew sharper. Someone whispered, "Wait," under their breath. I saw realization begin to dawn on a few faces. A man near the edge of the room straightened abruptly, eyes fixed on my father. His brow furrowed, then smoothed, then furrowed again. "Michael?" he said suddenly, not into the microphone but loud enough to carry. "Michael Davis?" My father startled. "Yes?" The man took a step forward, incredulous. "From Davis Holdings? You're that Michael Davis?" The room seemed to inhale all at once. My father hesitated, just a beat too long. "Yes," he said finally. "I suppose so." That was it.
No speech, no clarification, no list of accomplishments, just that. The confusion sharpened into something else. Recognition spread unevenly, like light through fog. A few people started whispering urgently to each other. Phones came out, discreetly at first. Someone laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because they were stunned. I watched faces change in real time. The man who'd spoken looked almost embarrassed. I've followed your work for years," he said. "I didn't realize—" My father raised a hand gently. "It's quite all right." Silence followed. Not the awkward kind, the heavy kind. Marianne hadn't moved. She stood frozen near the DJ booth, her glass forgotten in her hand. I watched her expression shift in slow motion. First, confusion. Then, irritation. Then, something like calculation. She scanned the room, catching fragments of whispers, noticing the changed posture of her friends, the way attention had subtly moved away from her. And then it landed. I saw it in her eyes. That moment when understanding arrives not as information, but as collapse. Her smile didn't drop. That would have been too obvious. But it tightened. She looked at my father again, really looked at him, at his calm posture, his unassuming clothes, his quiet refusal to engage. And for the first time that night, she looked small. Not humiliated, exposed. I lowered the microphone slowly. "I just wanted to say thank you," I said softly, "to the man who taught me that worth doesn't need an introduction." I handed the microphone back to the DJ without ceremony. No one clapped, no one spoke.
My father stood then, not to address the room, but to meet me halfway. He didn't look angry. He didn't look triumphant. He looked proud in a way I'd never seen before. Not because he'd been recognized, but because he hadn't needed to recognize himself. When he reached me, he didn't say a word. He just took my hand, squeezed it once, and smiled. And in the silence that followed, I knew something had shifted forever. Quietly, irreversibly. The room didn't rush back to life after that. People didn't suddenly laugh louder or clap to break the tension. The music didn't swell to rescue anyone from discomfort. Instead, everything resumed slowly, carefully, like a fragile object being set back down after nearly shattering. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. Guests leaned toward one another, not to gossip, but to recalibrate. The energy had shifted, and everyone could feel it, even if no one wanted to name it. Marianne was the first to move. She laughed lightly, a practiced sound, and lifted her glass as if nothing unusual had happened. "Well," she said, her voice bright, "that was unexpected." A few people smiled politely. No one echoed her enthusiasm. She drifted toward her friends, speaking a little louder than necessary, offering explanations no one had asked for. I watched her posture change, shoulders straightening, chin lifting, as if confidence could be summoned on command. But something was different now. Her friends didn't cluster as tightly around her. One of them glanced toward my father, then back at Marianne, uncertainty flickering across her face. Another excused herself mid-conversation, mumbling something about the restroom. Marianne noticed. Of course she did. She tried to reclaim control the only way she knew how, by rewriting the narrative. "I always knew there was more to Michael," she said to no one in particular, laughing softly. "I just love people who are so humble about their success." The word humble hung in the air, misplaced. No one contradicted her, but no one agreed either. That was the new dynamic. Not confrontation, not punishment. Distance. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but changes everything. Daniel stayed close to me, his hand warm in mine. He hadn't said much since the moment passed, but when he did speak, his voice was steady. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. I looked at him. "You're not angry?" He shook his head. "I wish I'd done it sooner." That surprised me more than anything else that night. Across the room, my father had become a quiet point of gravity. People approached him cautiously now, introducing themselves properly this time, asking real questions, listening instead of assuming. He answered politely, briefly, never elaborating more than necessary. He didn't bask in attention. He didn't correct anyone who still misunderstood. He was exactly the same man he'd been an hour ago, only the room had changed. Eventually, I found him near the edge of the dance floor, watching from a comfortable distance. I joined him without speaking at first. "I'm sorry," I said finally, "if that made you uncomfortable." He turned to me, surprised. "Why would that?" "I spoke for you," I said. "I didn't ask." He considered that, then smiled faintly. "You spoke about me," he said. "There's a difference." We stood together in silence, the music humming low behind us. "I never wanted you to feel like you had to defend me," he said gently. "I know, but I needed to." He looked at me then, really looked at me, the way he used to when I was younger and struggling with something I hadn't yet put into words. "You didn't do it for me," he said. "You did it for yourself." The realization settled slowly. He was right. I spent so long thinking strength meant enduring things quietly, watching you do it, learning from you. He nodded. "That's one kind of strength." "But it's not the only one," I added. He smiled, wider this time. "No, it isn't." We watched as Marianne passed by again, her smile careful now, her laughter measured. She caught my father's eye briefly and nodded, polite and distant.
He nodded back. Nothing more. And that was it. No apology, no confrontation, no dramatic reckoning. Just an understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Later, as the night thinned and guests began to leave, I found myself thinking back to the moment that had started everything. The look on my father's face when Mary Ann had spoken to him. That quiet sadness, that inward retreat. As we prepared to leave, my father hugged me tightly, longer than usual. When he pulled back, I searched his expression instinctively. The sadness was gone. In its place was something steadier, lighter. Not pride, not vindication, peace. And in that moment, standing in my wedding dress at the end of a long, complicated night, I finally understood what my father had been trying to teach me my whole life. People will always try to measure you by your job, by your clothes, by what they think you're worth. But the truth is simpler than that. Worth was never about money. It was always about dignity. Before you go, thank you for spending this time with me. It's always good to get to meet new people from all around the world. If this story meant something to you, do me a small favor and click to the subscribe button so you never miss a story. So, have you ever seen someone judged the wrong way or had to decide whether to speak up? Share your thoughts or your own experience in the comments. See you soon.